we are seeing thermal generators close. That's great. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels. But we also recognise that we need more electricity. If we're going to electrify most of transportation, we need a lot more electricity. In developed countries like Australia, we've for a long time been essentially had electricity demand fairly flat, and we have been essentially decarbonising by replacing thermal generation with renewables. Okay, what we're now about to see is demand for electricity ramping up. If you add green hydrogen to electrification of industry or of our society, it's going to be quite a steep ramp.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora. My guest on the show today needs no introduction to a global energy sector audience. He's the 29th Prime Minister of Australia. In this role, he focused heavily on decarbonisation within a challenging political environment. He announced and drove forward the Snowy 2.0 pumped hydro storage project, which is a 2 gigawatt, 175-hour energy storage project. He oversaw development of the National Energy Guarantee, which was a combined decarbonisation and security of supply policy, but unfortunately didn't quite make it into legislation. And in my mind, this was one of the big sliding door moments in recent Australian decarbonisation policy. Since his prime ministerial career, he's had a big focus on the energy sector, especially around long duration storage. He is a director of the International Hydropower Association and the chair of Fortescue Future Industries, which focuses, among other things, on green hydrogen. My guest on the show today is Malcolm Turnbull. Welcome, Malcolm.
Yeah, John, thank you very much. Great to be with you.
Thanks for joining, and glad we could find a time when we're both in Australia to record this. It makes
I know that's
easier.
Brilliant, and thank you for the very generous introduction.
So, why was long duration storage such a big focus of your policy as Prime Minister?
Well, I've always been very interested in and very committed to the energy transition. We do have only one planet, and we have to make sure we don't wreck it. But it came into very sharp focus for me in 2016 when they had the big blackout in South Australia, and I know the whys and wherefores were quite contentious. But one thing was very obvious to me at the time as I dug into it and reflected on it, was that we were putting more and more variable renewable energy, wind and solar, particularly wind in South Australia, into the grid. We were taking out continuous thermal generation, shutting down coal-fired power stations, which is a good thing. But what were we doing in terms of firming? And there had been, I think, a breezy assumption that there would always be $4 a gigajoule gas, and that was okay, and we just have, gas peakers. Now, of course, gas peakers are emissions intensive, so we shouldn't kid ourselves about the profile from that regard, but we're also kidding ourselves about the price of gas. And so that led me into thinking about what we should do about it. I read widely. I consulted widely. I spoke to a lot of people, including Andrew Blakers at the ANU, who's done so much fantastic work on pump storage. And so over that Australian summer of 16-17, I concluded that we needed to make pump storage a big priority. And so I gave a speech at the beginning of the year about that and other things, and immediately got on to, straight after the speech, on to Snowy Hydro and to Hydro Tasmania, which are our two big hydro schemes. They're the only, we have other hydro installations in Australia, as you know, but they're the only two big schemes. And Snowy was very, very responsive. Hydro Tasmania was a little reluctant to begin with, but my proposition really was to Snowy, look, I can see on on the map that you've got a number of big reservoirs at differing elevations. You've got topography around those reservoirs. There's got to be the opportunity for pump storage. The romantic part of the Snowy story is that they heard my speech, dived into the old files, found the plans for the Tantangra to Talbingo pump storage scheme, which had at first been started being conceptualized in the 1960s. The last time they believe anyone actually cited them, let alone did any work on them, was about 30 years ago, like in the early 90s. And so there it was. And so there were a couple of other options, and that's what we concluded. So it's two very big dams, 700 meters difference in elevation, 20 kilometers apart. And unfortunately, that's quite a lot of mountain to drill through. So that's the engineering challenge.
It is one thing I would say for state-run utilities. They were good at planning big projects in general.
Well, they were. And I mean, for Tassie, the big idea there was what I called and remain named the Battery of the Nation concept, which is essentially to match Tasmania's really world's best terrestrial wind assets with its hydro scheme, add an extra couple of interconnectors to the mainland, and you can deliver firmed renewable power, with using your water in a very conservative way, because you're just using it as a round trip, as a pump storage scheme to back up your wind. But I just make this observation though about pump storage generally. Snowy 2 in particular is a phenomenal, heroic, pick your superlative adjective project, but it is very sui generis. There aren't two big reservoirs like that in that situation anywhere else in Australia. And I mean, what we need, if we're going to do a lot of pump storage, and I passionately believe we all need to around the world, they've got to be more like the standard, Turkey's Nest Dam on the ridge above the reservoir, like Cruachan in Scotland, and so many others, which are just closed loop, round trip, fairly straightforward from a construction point of view. And you may not even have to have much tunneling. Your penstock may just run along the surface. So there's
interesting.
We've basically got to make make pump storage as much of a cookie cutter product as we can, and unless you think, and some people do, unless you think, batteries are going to provide the long duration electricity storage we need, which I don't think.
And we'll get to both of those, and in particular, what you need to make long duration storage modular, because presumably it's less about bureaucrats deciding and more about markets giving the right signals. Yeah. But it's reflecting on, I mean, in a sense, well before its time, because I think back to 2016, 17, and I think the general view was people weren't thinking about long duration storage. I think the discussion at the time was, renewables are cheap, solar costs are coming down massively, wind's already very cheap, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuel generation, and so decarbonisation's solved. And of course, that neglects the fact that might be true for 3/4 of the year or 8,000 hours of the year, but that last 800 hours of the year is very hard to decarbonise. And I think if anything's characterised the last few years, it's been the world waking up to the idea that renewables alone aren't enough. And it also sort of reflecting...
variable renewables aren't enough.
Exactly. Yeah. And I often on this podcast reflect on how crises often throw policy off track. Interesting that your reflection was that a crisis, and for those that weren't there, the lights went out in South Australia for about a day. through policy
in some
on track
parts of the state
potentially.
longer than that, actually. Yeah, no, it's pretty bad.
Yeah. So the natural question then is, we need lots of this. There's a gap. We don't know how to keep the lights on for long periods of time when we don't have variable renewables. Why won't the private sector deliver large volumes of long duration storage? You mentioned Kruaken. Will Gardner, the CEO of Drax, has been on this podcast before talking about that project. We've kind of got accustomed to unsubsidized variable renewables in solar and wind, and there may be those out there thinking, well, can't we have unsubsidized long duration storage? Why isn't the market delivering this right now?
The market may deliver it in the future without any subsidy or support, but I think right at the moment, energy only markets are going to have some form of capacity payment, as they do in the UK. You've written a great report on that recently, which I'd commend to our listeners. The New South Wales government here in Australia is working on what they call an LTESA scheme, which Aurora, I think, has provided them with some inputs into, and it's designed to do the same thing. Now, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that it inevitably, if you're talking about a battery that is cycling many times a day, that is responding in microseconds, that can buy cheap energy in this 5-minute block and, sell it in the next one, that's great. But what do we do, when, you have whatever the Australian verdunkelflatter is, and while we have a fair degree of resilience because we're a big country with the wind doesn't stop blowing everywhere, and certainly it isn't cloudy. It doesn't that's the at least during daylight hours the sun's shining somewhere. So, but we've got a big grid. But having said all of that, if you take the point of view that governments and market operators do, that it's a really bad idea to have blackouts, and that is a key performance indicator of any government is keeping the lights on. You're going to need to have that sort of insurance. Now, it may be that the economics of 8 hours of pumped hydro is nowhere near twice as good as the economics of 4 hours of pumped hydro because of the additional capex. And so that's where I think the system has got to pay for it. I think one of the problems, of course, is that people aren't used to it. Bankers, project financiers aren't used to it, so they'll be reluctant. But I mean, I remember when project financiers, were very wary about financing wind and solar in Australia. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation was providing, government somewhat concessional finance for what nowadays are just absolutely basic, bankable, wind and solar projects.
Yeah, that's
so it takes a while.
Yeah, common evolution as the sort of standardized market, government contract, high credit rating, and then people orient around a sort of way of contracting. It's interesting for you to, you went to capacity payments, and it's, I find it hard nowadays to find a market, particularly one with reasonable variable renewables penetration, that doesn't have some form of capacity payment in general. I think there are some that pretend they don't. I talk to Texans and they say no, but they have this pretty important scarcity adder in the market that drives value there.
How does that work, John?
Basically, what they do is, instead of what the Aussie system might have been a few years ago, where they would say the lights need to go out before the price gets up to the cap of 15,000. What the Texans do is they say, well, we'll send the price up to 15,000, 9,000 in Texas, but it's US dollars. We'll send it up to $9,000, but we'll do it a few gigawatts of surplus capacity on the system. So basically, we get the scarcity pricing in there, but we don't have to wait for people to be curtailed off the system before it happens. And I think it's just a political, well, there's a few things going on, but part of it is a political economy recognition that while an economist might tell you the optimal amount of lost load is 3 hours in expectation, the politically correct answer is 0. I don't know, this is probably a good question for you. If someone interviewed you when you had your prime minister's hat on and they said, are we, what's the optimal level of lost load for insufficient generation capacity?
Oh, yeah.
Would you have given them the real answer?
I mean, the real answer is, as I said, is 0. I mean, look, there isn't a problem with curtailing industries that can cater for it, right? There isn't you can, demand management, or what, Alan Finkel used to call negawatts, is a very valuable thing to have. If you can, turn the smelter down, for 15 minutes and, to no ill effect, that can be very useful. And, ditto with data centers. They can switch to their alternative power source for a short time. That can be very valuable too. But once you start, switching off, people's air conditioning at home on a hot day and, and
TV show.
Yeah. I mean, you can't, it's because it's just seen as a key measure of competence.
Yeah.
I mean, I was very struck once when I was Prime Minister to go down to Port Lincoln, which is, you might know is in South Australia. Obviously, it's a big tuna fishing centre and tuna breeding centre, and so there's huge industry, and they have massive cool rooms, as you can imagine. And their power that time was so unreliable. They were literally running them much of the time off their own generators. Their power was unreliable and it was too expensive. And they were saying to me, look, we do ask ourselves, are we actually living in a first world country here? This is a bit crazy. We are surely we can get reliable, affordable electricity. And, that's how people feel.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite reasonable. And of course, the fact is that, South Australia, which used to have the most expensive and the least reliable energy in Australia, is now, simply because of better planning, or as I used to say when I was in politics, running your energy system with engineering and economics, not ideology and idiocy. By doing that, they've got the most, not every day, but very often the most affordable and reliable electricity in the country. So they've turned it right around. So, renewables at wind and solar are cheaper. Fact. Problem is, the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine all the time. But, as many people have said, we can't live without water, but it doesn't rain every day. We have actually worked out how to store water. So we just have to plan it, and then we can have, the thing that frustrates me about a lot of the political debate, it frustrated me when I was in politics and still does, is the suggestion that somehow or other we don't have the tools to do this. We do. We have all the tools to move to a zero emission energy economy. Of course, you can't do so instantly, and you have to plan it and you have to get on with it. And, if you're Germany, deciding to shut down your nuclear power stations isn't a terribly smart thing to do. And of course, the Europeans are now really up against it, following Putin's, brutal invasion of Ukraine, with their dependence on Russian gas. But can they get there? Yes, they absolutely can get there, but they've got to decide where they want to go and then put in place the infrastructure to do it.
Yeah, and to your point of competence, I mean, it is. I find it always interesting, and you talk to your average Australian, but you also see it in surveys. People will tolerate the lights going out because a tree falls on the line. They're far less patient when it comes to lights going out because there wasn't sufficient generation or demand was too high. It goes to that, hey, we're in an industrialized economy. Can we please keep the lights on in general? We've talked about a bunch of different technologies. Do you have a clear view of how this is going to play out now? And I suppose the analog I think about is transport, personal transport, where to me, it looks like electric vehicles. There's been a tipping point, basically. You see EVs all over the place, all over the world, and maybe not in every vehicle segment. EVs have beaten whatever it is, hydrogen or some other form of transport. Are you seeing clear winners now in the long duration storage space of, say, 8+ hours, 8+ hours?
Well, I think it's very hard to beat pumped storage in 8+ hours storage, electricity storage. In fact, I'm not sure there's any, that's the other alternatives are rather vastly too expensive or theoretical at this stage. I mean, it's the figure we all throw around. It's 95% or thereabouts of the world's stored electricity is in pumped storage. So there's no question that it works. It's what we could call an oldie but a goodie. And the plants that you build will be there in a couple of 100 years, as long as they're maintained. So, and you can't say that about batteries or most things. So look, I think, but having said that, does that mean it'll always be the answer? I don't know. But honestly, John, I reckon if we're serious about moving rapidly to a zero emission energy economy, we've got to tick all of the above. There's no point. And the one thing we must never do is fall into whatever the, energy equivalent of vaporware is, where you start saying, oh, we don't have to do anything now because somebody's developing a new gizmo that's just coming around the corner and we'll do nothing and wait till that arrives. We see a bit of that here with our Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, saying, oh, we're not going to be able to achieve this without technologies that have not yet arrived. I mean, that is just nonsense, absolute rubbish. We can get there with the tech we've got today. I'm sure there will be new tech, and I'm sure the tech we've got will be improved. But the fundamental problem with pumped storage is the very simple fact that Moore's law does not apply to digging holes. And so it takes a lot longer, to build a pumped hydro system than it does to build a wind farm or a solar farm. And so the pace of variable renewable rollout is rapid. That is putting continuing pressure on the continuous thermal generators. So they're going out of business. But, we need to get cracking on building the pump storage to provide the firming. So it's, we've got to get on with it, which is why I pushed so hard on Snowy. And I'm glad it was too far progressed for my successors to dither about it as they have with Battery of the Nation. But, at least Snowy is being built. I mean, they say it's going to be completed on time, but that would be great. But even if it's, a year late or something like that, you unless you get cracking on these things, you just don't get them built.
And so I know you're, as I mentioned in the intro, you're focused on green hydrogen as well. Is the implication here that you see the main applications of green hydrogen outside power generation, and you don't see that as the sort of long-term role for green hydrogen?
I don't entirely agree with Michael Liebrich's, ladder of hydrogen ladder, but I think there's a good insight there that there are some sectors that are very hard to decarbonize without green hydrogen. Obvious, shipping, steel making, and there are many others. So there are a lot of things that you're going to need green hydrogen for that you can't do with electricity and stored electricity alone. So look, we may find that the EV has trumped the hybrid fuel cell vehicle for transportation, so probably for light transportation, heavy transportation, trains, perhaps ships. No, I wouldn't have thought so. So the point is, it's very hard to predict who's going to win, but the demands for green hydrogen range from gigantic to intergalactically gigantic. I just think, people arguing about how huge is huge is a bit, we're so far from having the capacity to do it, which is why I'm glad to be helping Andrew Forrest insofar as I can. But I want to make this point, though, about the electricity grid, though. We are seeing thermal generators close. That's great. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels. But we also recognise that we need more electricity. If we're going to electrify most of transportation, we need a lot more electricity. In developed countries like Australia, we've for a long time been essentially had electricity demand fairly flat, and you've got a better understanding of that than me as an economist in this area. But electricity demand has been fairly flat, and we have been essentially decarbonising by replacing thermal generation with renewables. Okay, what we're now about to see is demand for electricity ramping up. And if you add green hydrogen to electrification of industry, or of our society, it's going to be quite a steep ramp. So we shouldn't kid ourselves about the need, and particularly in Australia, the renewables can be rolled out very quickly. The wind and solar. The big problem's going to be the storage, I think, unless we get on with it.
Yeah. Okay, interesting perspective. I mean, I haven't done the maths, but in the universe of potential applications of green hydrogen, it wouldn't surprise me if peaking power was a relatively small one in general.
A small but a very important one. See, this is the point. I mean, it may not be, it's that the ability to have a clean green peaking fuel is enormously important, but that doesn't mean you're going to be using as many molecules for that application as you are, for example, in making green steel or, powering the world's, shipping industry.
No. And from a net zero perspective, I think reassuring that it exists. I mean, for example, pumped hydro, wonderful, and in certain locations, extremely low cost. I always ask, once we start to talk about dozens of gigawatts in Australia, do we have the sites and do we have the democratic will, NIMBYism, these types of things to actually develop them all?
That is a really good point, but that is why I'm very pleased that I had the privilege of being PM and being able to get Snowy 2 underway. I think it'll be a great piece of nation building infrastructure, but it's not typical. And the problem with dams is that a lot of people say dams, oh my God, you're going to put a dam across a river, you're going to flood all these ecosystems and the fish won't be able to get up the hills, up the river and all of those things.
And then you've got to manage them for the fish as well. You can't necessarily optimize around power, those types of things.
Yeah, all of that stuff. But the big opportunity, the cookie cutter for pumped hydro is the Turkey's Nest Dam on the hill above the existing reservoir. And there are thousands of sites for that. And there are also even more thousands, and Andy Blaker's work at ANU has exposed them, where you can actually build 2 off-river reservoirs, where you build a Turkey's Nest Dam on top of the hill and you find a gully down the bottom of the hill and you build in effect a Turkey's Nest Dam there too, and you connect them. But that's fine, that's innocuous, but equally a sort of a closed loop system, and the one in the UK that I visited when I was up in Scotland at the COP, Cruachan above Loch Orr, is like a classic. That's a classic case. And you look at that and you say, well, really, I mean, you're not moving water from one lake to another. You're not moving water from one water, let alone one watershed to another. It's just, I think
it's actually a new turbine or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, how could that be? It's hard. I find it hard. I'm sure someone will find an answer, but I find it hard to see how that presents big environmental challenges.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what we need. That's what we kind of need, in my view, to normalize. We need to make that type of pump storage stock standard.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
In my humble opinion. Yeah.
To conclude, let's just say, for whatever political reason that's not feasible, it feels like green hydrogen. If CCUS doesn't feel particularly proven, lithium ion, the numbers start to get pretty big once you talk about very long duration storage. My team in the UK said it was about to keep the lights on for the worst week of the year in a net zero system was about £750 billion for lithium ion, maybe 30 or 40 billion for peaking plants, for fossil fuel peaking plants. So to some extent now, as we think about proven technologies, green hydrogen might play a role in that peaking system, or it's at least nice to have the backstop if that's the way the world evolves.
If you look at I agree. I mean, I think that's why I say it's all of the above. But if you look at say Scotland, with a huge amount of wind, limits on the transmission down to the rest of the UK, and with pump storage operators like DRAX are being paid to take that load and pump the water up the hill, which is pretty cool because I then get paid even more when it runs downhill. Equally, an electrolyzer can be soaking up that surplus generation as well. I think this business of getting off fossil fuels is it's such a big existential issue that I think we should throw everything at it.
I'd like to zoom out from long duration storage and focus on the energy sector more broadly. First of all, it's the item of the moment is the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, which you mentioned before. How do you, at a big picture level, how do you see this impacting the energy transition globally?
Well, clearly, it has sent up the price of oil, and obviously it's going to threaten gas supplies to Europe. Now, we're not sure, can Europe afford to stop buying Russian gas? Will the Russians cut off the gas? It is hard to know. This is a shocking, irrational, brutal act of war, and you would be rash to forecast any, what the outcomes could be. I mean, it's, but I look, I mean, let's say the Europeans started buying a lot less gas. Let's say the Russians, the gas pipelines were interrupted. This, again, much better than me, this is your business, but the Russians have got limited capacity to sell that gas anywhere else. As far as oil is concerned, it's very fungible. So I think the longer term impact on the oil price will be, less dramatic, as long as there are people that are prepared to buy Russian oil, and that China obviously doesn't appear to be moved by this. India doesn't appear to be moved by this. So there will be markets for Russian hydrocarbons. I think that's some thoughts on the immediate consequences. Longer term, this has got to hasten Europe's transition to clean energy. I mean, they cannot, the Europeans cannot remain dependent on Russian gas. It's as simple as that. I mean, and that's why I was saying earlier that I thought that the decision of Angela Merkel's to phase out German civil nuclear generation was such a terrible mistake. I mean, I can understand the politics post Fukushima, but really, energy dependence on Russia is clearly a terrible mistake. They're going to need to import more LNG, but they're going to have to get very, very serious about alternatives to gas, whether that is green hydrogen, so a cleaner form of gas, or whether it's peat pumps and other solutions, in terms of winter heating.
So I've spent quite a bit of time on German energy policy and in Germany, and as an outsider, politics makes a lot more sense if you understand the German Green Party as first and foremost an anti-nuclear party rather
Yeah.
than a decarbonisation party. And this is about, I think last time I checked, 20% of the vote. Someone can correct me on that, but things start to make sense in that context, I think. Would you dare to suggest that it could have an impact on indigenous fossil fuel production or the nuclear industry in Europe? Do you think we'll see a renaissance of either of those?
Well, again, you'd be a much better judge than me. So I think ultimately, just as it's a key performance indicator for governments to keep the lights on, it's also a key performance indicator to have people being able to buy affordable energy to keep their homes warm in winter. And so, governments will do what they have to do in the short term. That may mean some coal-fired power stations are brought back online, but these, I think these will be temporary measures. There will have to be a very concerted effort to become independent of Russia. That doesn't mean that they'd stop buying, let's say, it depends how this war ends, right? This war may end with Putin being overthrown. I think that's, I remember Tom Friedman had a piece in the New York Times recently as the least likely of three outcomes. I think it's one of them. I think it's very likely. We're dealing with actors that are not one actor in particular that is not really rational. I've dealt with Putin in years past, and a lot of people who've dealt with him would make the same observation, that he always appeared to be very calculating and clear-eyed and rational, or that is to say reasoned, but his ranting about Ukraine and the manner he's conducted this war, the lies that have been told, just this kind of assumption that the Ukraine government was going to fold up like a pack of cards in a few days. All of that doesn't seem to be the product of a calculating, careful mind to me. So something's at a miss in the Kremlin, I think.
Just following up on the Ukraine rolling up, does Ukraine's resistance give you more confidence in Western resolve to stand its ground, to defend its values than you had before this?
I think we are all in awe at the courage of the Ukrainians and the leadership that President Zelensky has shown. They've not just defied Putin, they have confounded the expectations, the grim expectations of many others. The West is obviously walking a fine line, trying to provide the means, the physical armament means for Ukraine to defend itself, but without triggering a European war. But I know Putin has obviously sort of threatened nuclear war, but that's most observers believe he hasn't lost the plot to the extent that he'd actually embark on that, which would just be a suicide mission, and regrettably he'd take a lot of other people with him, including many in the West. It's a very tough period. What's likely to emerge is, you'd have to say at best for Putin, is a quagmire.
Yeah.
And they whether it's the Russians in Afghanistan or the Americans in Vietnam, that's not a place to be. Yes, I think NATO has been supportive, the West has been supportive, so has Australia, and it's way limited by our geography. But really, the heroes of the hour are the Ukrainians.
So from one quagmire to another quagmire, do you think energy sector policy is more difficult in Australia than elsewhere?
Yes. Oh, yeah, definitely. It's. The only place I'm familiar with where it's comparably difficult is the United States, and essentially the problem here has been as it has in America, but I'll just talk about Australia. It has been the way in which energy policy and really climate policy was turned into an ideological or identity issue. And that really was done with full force by Tony Abbott, who used that to sort of overthrow me as leader of the Liberal Party. I've lost the Liberal leadership twice, both as opposition leader and Prime Minister, something of an accomplishment, you might think.
And arguably both over decarbonisation policy.
Oh, totally. Exactly.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes. And so Abbott, because if you go back in history, in 2006-7, when John Howard was still Prime Minister and I was the Environment Minister, Howard's policy was to have an emissions trading scheme. He went to the 2007 election with an ETS as his
That was
policy.
the Shergold review, I think. Was that the one?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It emerged from the Shergold review. And anyway, Rudd won the election. Rudd took over the policy. It was also Labor's policy. The same team, led by Martin Parkinson, that had been designing the ETS under Howard, continued to design it under Rudd. And, while Kevin was always keen to put his own label on it, and it was absolutely, the ETS, had two prime ministerial parents, John Howard at the conception and Kevin Rudd. And I was supporting it because I'd taken the view, as opposition leader by this stage, that the Liberal Party had not changed its policy. We'd gone into opposition, but we maintained our policy. But there was this sort of drumbeat from the right with Abbott, the Murdoch media, which plays an outsized role in our politics here and has been a consistent voice against climate action. That's another several books to write, or many books have been written about that. But look, that's like Fox News in the United States. Look at the damage that's done to climate action over many years. Anyway, you had those two populist right-wing politics, right-wing media, mostly Murdoch's, and of course the fossil fuel sector. And they basically resulted in the issue becoming really weaponized. And so began what has been called the climate wars. And they still continue, to the point that Australia was, under Morrison, my successor, was the only developed country that didn't take an increase in its 2030 target to the Glasgow COP. We've got the same target that we had in 2015 at the Paris COP. The Australian Pavilion in Glasgow, as I'm sure some of your listeners will recall, featured as its principal exhibit an example, theoretical I might add, of carbon capture and storage by a gas company called Santos. I mean, now, what sort of mentality would have you highlighting a gas company at a climate conference? I don't know. Seems pretty wild, but it just shows you how out of step government has been here. Now, the good news is that in Australia, as a federation, the state and territory governments are much more progressive, including the Liberal ones. I mean, Matt Keane, who's the Liberal Energy Minister and Treasurer now in New South Wales, is really forging ahead with a pump storage agenda and, a lot of other energy transition measures, as are his other state counterparts. And of course, business in Australia is getting on with it, whether it's the banks or Andrew Forrest with green hydrogen, Mike Cannon-Brookes trying to take over AGL. It's so that this is why when Origin decided to close one of its huge coal-fired power stations earlier, bringing it forward from the 2030s to 2025, didn't even bother talking to the Federal Energy Minister. Taylor has become irrelevant, and really the states are taking the lead. I never thought I'd say this as a former member of the National Parliament, but 3 cheers for federation. Thank heavens the states can pick up the slack when the federal government, abandons its responsibilities.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? To me, at least, it feels like when the neg didn't get up, that was the invitation for the states to play a role. There was a vacuum created.
Well, the neg had two parts. The first part was the reliability part of it. So it was an obligation on retailers to buy energy from, generators that had a reliability measure and a emissions intensity measure, which was to decline in accordance with our international commitments. And it was the emissions intensity thing that the right blew up over. And so, I guess you could say half the neg survived, but the bit that was really important from a climate point of view did not. So the federal government has no climate mechanism at all in the electricity market. All of the policy that affects emissions in the electricity market is being driven by states in practical terms now.
Yeah.
And of course, the market, John, as we were saying earlier, the cheaper and cheaper variable renewable energy is sending the coal-fired generators broke.
Exactly. A lot of cheap solar. And I should add, Aurora did modelling underpinning, as you mentioned, you very kindly mentioned the New South Wales scheme, and also the recent Victorian offshore wind scheme, which is sort of a centerpiece there. So can attest to the fact that the states are pushing forward some of the major decarbonisation policies in Australia with Aurora's support. So you talked about the forces pushing decarbonisation in Australia. Is there something about us Australians being, coal exporters, a lot of regional jobs being dependent on fossil fuel industries that makes it hard as well? The way you position it was the politics and the personalities. Is there something fundamental about, major coal exporters? Kevin Rudd, for example, had a mining resources rent tax battle, I think, towards the start of his first prime ministership. And it was a problem. I suspect one of the lessons he took away was, don't take on the big miners in Australia.
Yeah, it wasn't a very good tax. I don't think it, or indeed its replacement. Well, its replacement raised no money, and I don't think that Kevin's original conception was actually well designed.
Does the punchline remain, though? There's something hard about
taking
on. Australia, in the UK, you can take on coal generation because there's no coal. Thatcher got rid of coal mining a long time ago. There's not a sort of big dog to attack you if you take that on. Whereas in Australia,
I think that you're absolutely right. The resources sector is very powerful and very political.
So Malcolm, I'd like to conclude by asking you about a few concepts in the energy transition. To ask you if you think they're overrated or underrated as concepts.
Yep. Okay.
So let me start with the first one. The role of electricity as opposed to molecules like hydrogen in a net zero economy. Is it overrated or underrated?
I think it's about right. I think if anything, it's probably slightly underrated, but time will tell.
Okay. The second one, humanity's ability to hit net zero emissions by 2050.
Underrated.
And finally, the importance of technological progress in reaching net zero emissions globally. Is it overrated or underrated?
I think it's overrated in the sense that we can get there with the tech that we have. But having said that, I would never, history tells you that we generally tend to underestimate the significance of technological progress. So I'm sorry I'm having a bit of a bet both ways, but what a lot of people use, the technology, future technology as a kind of vaporware to get to justify doing less now.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting take on it. That's a good note to finish on, Malcolm. Thanks for taking the time to talk through Australia's somewhat perplexing energy politics for our global audience. Malcolm Turnbull, thanks so much for taking the time to speak.
Thanks, John. Great to be with you.
That was John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora, speaking to Malcolm Turnbull, the 29th Prime Minister of Australia. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.